This is a project I started a few years ago on the invitation of the Centro de Investigaciones Paleontológicas in Villa de Leyva, who were looking for an external person to work on the ichthyosaur specimens housed in their collections. So historically speaking, our view of Cretaceous ichthyosaur diversity has been one of almost a relict fauna. So as recently as 2003, the view of ichthyosaur diversity was that it reached a high point in the Triassic and early Jurassic, and then declined precipitously. And in the early Cretaceous, there were only 2 genera considered valid still around, leading to the extinction of the group in the late Cretaceous. Now, this view has, in recent times, become somewhat more nuanced, with the recognition that our view of ichthyosaur diversity and that of these large Mesozoic marine reptiles more generally is strongly controlled by the occurrence of black shale facies. So in time periods where there is a well-studied Lagerstätte, for instance, the Posidonia shale here in the Toarcian, or the Blue Lias formation here in the earlier Jurassic, you get these diversity peaks in the marine reptile fauna, including ichthyosaurs. So, for instance, in the case of the Toarcian, this entire diversity peak, all genera, can be found at a single locality in southwestern Germany. So this is not necessarily a global picture. In the early Cretaceous, these Lagerstätte represented by stars have not been thoroughly studied or located, leading to a diversity minimum during this time. So the recent work of Valentin Fischer has increased our understanding of early Cretaceous ichthyosaur diversity substantially. So the number of known taxa have increased. But as you can see, especially in the early Cretaceous, there's still this large gap between the number of taxa that we think should be present based on phylogenetically controlled diversity estimates versus the number of taxa we've actually found in the fossil record. Moreover, the named taxa do not co-occur in space and time. So the general rule is one formation, one valid ichthyosaur taxon. And this is supported by the view of ecospace occupation, specifically relating to the jaws and dental morphology, in which in the early Cretaceous here, again, in general, there's only one ichthyosaur ecomorph present, suggesting that based on some sort of perhaps competitive exclusion mechanism, this is leading ichthyosaurs to a low diversity in any one geological formation and lack of co-occurrence between taxa. So where do these early Cretaceous ichthyosaurs occur? Well, they have been found all over the world, but as with most vertebrate material, the record is strongly biased towards the northern hemisphere, specifically Europe and North America. So there are extensive records throughout the western interior of North America, as well as the tethys of Europe and European Russia over here. There are a few finds, including one that is currently subject of ongoing research in Chile and Argentina, and then extensive material from high latitudes of Australia. In terms of the tropical record, here, there are only 2 occurrences. One here is Malouania. This is a genus that was recovered from the early Cretaceous of what is now modern-day Iraq. It's an isolated find, and it's a relic to a lineage, so its closest relatives are early Jurassic in age. It is very far phylogenetically removed from the rest of the early Cretaceous ichthyosaurs. The second tropical locality is the one I'm going to be talking about today, and that is this locality here in northern South America, in what is now present-day Colombia. So as in the past, modern Colombia sits on the equator, and it is considered to be a mega-diverse country. So that is to say it has exceptional biological diversity, both in the terrestrial fauna and in the marine fauna. It is also very mountainous, and the locality I'm going to be discussing today is exposed in the eastern Cordillera of the Andes. So this makes the geology a bit complicated in the region because it has been very tectonically active throughout the Mesozoic. The locality is located near the town of Villa de Leyva in the Boyacá region, and Villa de Leyva is an extremely touristy town, based and focusing on its Spanish colonial architecture, and it has no fewer than 3 paleontological museums for a town of several thousand people. So one of them, the one I'm working with, the Centro de Investigaciones Paleontológicas, is a family-run museum. There's also a town museum and an interpretive center run by the Geological Survey of Colombia. Vertebrate localities around Villa de Leyva have been known for some time. The first institution to do collecting there was the University of California that ran expeditions in 1945 and 1948. One of the specimens, the one published by Wellis in 1962, an almost complete elasmosaur from the region, is housed at UC Berkeley. The other specimen, also a complete elasmosaur collected in 1948, is housed at the Geological Survey in Colombia, in Bogotá. The institution with which I'm working, the Centro de Investigaciones Paleontológicas, is the institution that is doing the bulk of the collecting in the region today. And it started out as a private collection of Carlos Padilla, who was just collecting as a hobbyist in the region. He passed away a few years ago, and his family has continued to run has continued his tradition of collecting, and has opened a public museum, and has committed to scientific requirements in terms of housing and curating the collections. So in Colombia, it's illegal to sell fossils from Colombia, and so the fossils can be, or will be cared for in this institution. The Centro de Investigaciones does all their own preparation of the material, but at this time don't have the scientific expertise on staff, which is why they invite people, including me, to come work on the material and raise the profile of the locality in the scientific literature. So the area around Villa de Leyva that yields the fossils is kind of this region here, and it's semi-arid, so there's not a lot of vegetative cover, which is how the finds come to light. They're recovered mostly through building activity and just prospecting on unvegetated outcrop. There's no active quarrying taking place in the region. So this is the town here, for the record. Looking at the geology of the region, aside from quaternary river deposits indicated here in the white, it's almost all early Cretaceous, ranging from Hoderivian to Actian, or early Albian, according to some authors. And previously it was all attributed to the Paha Formation. Now the basal member has been reassigned to the Villa de Leyva Formation. The vertebrate material comes almost exclusively from the middle member and is Barremian to Actian in age. The historical localities, or the localities that have yielded published material, are indicated by numbers here. In general, localities further north yield Barremian material and further south yield Actian material. So the section in Villa de Leyva is 400 to 500 meters thick, so it's a very large package of rock. And it's black shales interbedded with limestone horizons. Unfortunately, most vertebrate occurrences are unconstrained. So Carlos Padilla, when he was doing his collecting, took detailed notes involving locality information, but was unaware and unschooled in biostratigraphic constraints of material. Most localities look like this, so they are very near the surface, and you can see here all this is exposed rock, essentially, weathering off. The sediments are unconsolidated, so can be excavated just with shovels, but the vertebrates themselves tend to be encased in calcareous concretions and are prepared usually using acid. Although the vertebrate occurrences are largely unconstrained, ammonites are extremely abundant, and the ammonite stratigraphy in the region has been well worked out and fits nicely with the Tethyan stratigraphy of Europe. So all that is really needed is to revisit these historical localities and collect ammonite data to get good age constraints on the material. So as I previously mentioned, both the vertebrate and invertebrate material is enclosed in calcareous concretions. These are normally collected by surface collection and are generally used in decorative building stones, for instance this wall, which has been built out of concretions containing mostly ammonites, but also quite a lot of fish. This is the town museum showing some of the fish remains. So for instance, here's calcareous concretion, and you can see there's the front half of a fish in there. Here are some more fish heads, a tail, some plants. So remains are quite abundant at the locality. But because the calcareous concretions are so hard, preparation takes a lot of time and because it is done using acid, some delicate elements tend to be accidentally removed. The larger vertebrates are also in concretions. So here is an ichthyosaur, preserved as 3 concretions, one for the skull, anterior vertebral column, and an unprepared concretion for the posteriorly. The parts of the skeleton not enclosed in concretions are not collected, either because they weathered away before collection occurred, because the collectors didn't notice them when they were just picking up concretions off the surface, or because taphonomically they weren't fossilized if they weren't encased in the robust calcite matrix. Which of the 3 is true as a rule is uncertain. However, based on just general collecting, I'm fairly certain that it is that the bone not enclosed in concretions weathers away prior to collection. However, the result is that we have a lot of skulls and not a lot of more distal elements, limbs, girdles, tails, that sort of thing, for the large vertebrates. The depositional environment is actually more controversial than one would think for a black shale environment. The dominant model in the paleontological literature is that it's actually intertidal. So sort of the Sabkha environment, in fact it's been explicitly compared to the Red Sea Sabkha environments. And this interpretation was arrived at based on cannel coal, so algal coal, which was thought to be attributed to stromatolites, gypsum weathering in a reddish color, and that about summarizes it. And for instance, cracks in the concretions here, for instance, has been attributed to mud cracking. This is contradicted by the fauna in general, which is very typical of an open marine vertebrate fauna. So larger tuniform-shaped fishes, large marine reptiles, some with skulls approaching 2 meters in length, which are unlikely possibly to have been deposited in this kind of intertidal environment. The alternative model is more popular in the isotope literature and is also found on the Colombian Geological Survey maps, and that it is a mid-shelf environment in a back arc basin. So here there would have been an emergent high, so it's not necessarily further from the coast, or that far from the coast, but it was submerged during the depositional period. Now, as I previously mentioned, this middle member of the formation spans 16 million years, so it's entirely possible that periodically during that time, it was emergent. However, I do tend to favor the second model, that of the shelf. So looking at the vertebrate fauna more generally, sauropterygians are extremely diverse and abundant, including smaller pliosaurs, like Stenyorhynchosaurus here, elasmosaurs, such as the material described by Wellis, Kronosaurus, which would have been the apex predator in the system. This is an extremely large individual. The teeth are over 30 centimeters in length. And as well as some turtles, which have been interpreted as either marine or nearshore in habitat, and some isolated dinosaur remains. So for instance, this partial sauropod that was recently described. In terms of fishes, only a single find has been described, not this one, a partial torso chunk from an Aspidorhynchus. However, this is not representative of the number of fishes found at the locality. They are quite diverse and abundant. The material just has not been described as of yet. So in addition to these other marine reptiles, there are also abundant ichthyosaur remains, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. In terms of formal description, 2 have been described, both based on isolated skulls. The first was described in 1997, Platyturgius sacchacarum here. There are some vertebrae on the posterior part of the mount here. These were added for cosmetic reasons and don't necessarily belong to this specimen. And the second one, Wiscosaurus catheti, I recently described this year. So Platyturgius sacchacarum was described by Maria Caramo Fonseca in 1997. And although in the initial description the stratigraphic age was considered as unknown, it was later assigned as early Actian. In terms of diagnostic characteristics, the narial region is quite distinctive, and that is that the external nares are completely divided by an ascending process of the maxilla into a larger round posterior opening here and an anterior narrow slit. This is a large individual. The holotype skull is about 94 centimeters in length, which, while not the biggest Cretaceous ichthyosaur, is still a substantial animal. So in terms of ecomorphology, both the mandible, you can see here, is quite deep and robust, but the teeth have relatively small crowns relative to their total length. So this is the premaxilla up here, and this is the mandible down here, and you can see that the teeth don't span the entire width of the jaws. The crowns are robust and striated, and they show extensive wear facets on the tips. And this is consistent with the generalist ichthyosaur Sensu Fisher's 2016 terminology. This is in contrast to, for instance, Platyturgius australis, a congener from Australia. And you can see here the tooth crowns are quite a bit larger. This is what the apex predator ichthyosaur morphotype looks like. Keep in mind that in neither case is this the apex predator, because both localities have Kronosaurus, the big pliosaur. The second specimen, Wiscosaurus catheti, is also stratigraphically unconstrained. I'll have to revisit the locality and collect ammonite in this case. The bony nares in this taxon are incompletely divided by a descending spur of the nasal, so it's quite a lot different from Platyturgius that I showed earlier. Unfortunately, the holotype and only referred specimen is a juvenile, so the mandible is estimated at only 50 to 60 centimeters in length. The reason I think it is a juvenile is that, first of all, the sclerotic ring almost completely fills the orbital opening, which is considered a juvenile feature. Also, in the vertebral column, the zygapophyses are incompletely ossified, and the cortical bone does not extend to the anterior and posterior margins of the centra, which is something also we tend to see in juvenile material. Ichthyosaurs, unfortunately, have an osteoporotic bone structure, so histological analysis won't shed light on this question. The mandible and teeth in Wiscosaurus are more slender than in Platyturgius sacchacarum, But based on the Morphospace descriptions of Fisher, this still fits into a generalist diet. However, based on some work I've done in early Jurassic ichthyosaurs, ontogeny may affect both tooth morphology and diet in ichthyosaurs. So just because this material is falling into kind of this generalist morphospace as a juvenile, doesn't necessarily shed any information on the adult diet. In addition to these two taxa, there is also at least a third taxon present. This one is very tightly stratigraphically constrained, based on ammonites adhering to the posterior region of this skeleton, as well as my having revisited the locality of that skull and collected further ammonites. And this suggests that this taxon is late Barremian to earliest Aptian in age. It's got quite a large skull, so the mandibular length of the top specimen is 78 centimeters. The bottom skull is 95 centimeters long. As you can see in the bottom here, this skull is quite strongly dorsoventrally compressed, indicating that just being enclosed in a calcareous concretion isn't enough to completely avoid deformation, or else the concretion formed fairly late in the preservation of these animals. So how is this taxon different than the other two? Firstly, in terms of mandibular morphology. So the rostrum is very long and very, very slender. And the orbit is also quite large. Looking at the rostrum in ventral view, we see that the symphysis is very, very flat and is made up of both angular and splenial and equal contributions. Looking at something more typical, in this case Muscosaurus, we can see that the angular in the area of the symphysis is only a very thin splint, and the skull is more laterally compressed. In addition, this new taxon, the premaxillae are not sutured at all. There's no even contact facets for the right and left elements. And this suggests that the bite force was probably weak, something that could also have been inferred based on the shallow, ventrally oriented mandible, slender retroarticular process, and just very long jaws. So in terms of ecomorphology of the rostrum, it seems that this taxon was doing something slightly different, certainly from Platyturgius sacchacarum, but probably also from Muscosaurus. Interestingly, the tooth crowns are extremely large, so here are the teeth here, but also very, very slender. And completely without wear. Based on Massari's system, this suggests a fish-based diet. But based on measurement data, this taxon doesn't fit nicely into Fisher's apex predator generalist soft prey specialist scheme, in that the tooth crowns are and the teeth in general are much larger than what we see here, but the teeth are much less robust than in generalists. Parsimony analysis groups both these taxa as quite closely related to each other, as well as to other early Cretaceous ichthyosaurs within the clade that Fisher calls Platypteryginae, so both very closely related to, say, Platypterygis australis. Taxon 3 is problematic and results in a giant polytomy and complete collapse of the analysis. This is possibly because of missing data, both pertaining to the dermal skull and the postcranium. So these three new taxa all sort of occupy this generalist morphology, with the possible exception of taxon 3, and thus do not increase our knowledge of ecomorphological diversity in early Cretaceous ichthyosaurs. It is also possible, based on the amount of time involved, that these three were not contemporaneous, although they are all found in the same formation, which is a first for, again, the early Cretaceous. So there's also been a new find in 2015 in someone's driveway. This find comes with postcranial and is very, very large. So the skull is 1.5 meters long in this animal. Based on morphology of the basioccipital and forefin, it is also closely related to other Cretaceous ichthyosaurs, but requires further study. So, in summary, there is an unusually high taxonomic diversity of ichthyosaurs within the Taha Formation for the early Cretaceous, but there is relatively low morphological diversity, although differentiation in jaw and tooth morphology is present. Further directions, it's very important to get good biostratigraphic controls for both this material and historically collected material through revisitation of localities. And also, in order to better understand the paleoecology of the formation, better documentation of the fish record is essential. So for instance, this here is a more or less complete Spidorhynchus that is prepared but has never been studied. And this work will allow us to better understand the development of latitudinal gradients in marine diversity among the vertebrates. So I'd especially like to thank my collaborators at the Centro de Investigaciones Paleontológicas, Marie-Louise Parra and Santiago Padilla, without whose collaboration this work would not have been possible, as well as other individuals and funding organizations.